Hi, I'm Donna from the Masquerade, and as you can see I have a really old machine here. This machine is from 1914. It's a Pfister and Rossmann, a German machine, and I'm about to do a project on it. So, I'm going to call this my worldly and pretty timeless project. I'm going to hand crank a Quiltworks pattern, and this pattern was designed in Tucson, Arizona by Quilt Market, a little quilt shop in Tucson, out of pieces that were designed in Kalispell, Montana by Judy Niemeyer, and I'm going to do it on a machine from Germany that was sold in London, and I'm going to teach it to a class in Seattle, Washington, and I'm doing it all here in Salem, New Hampshire. So this is a pretty worldly quilt. Worldly and timeless. I'm using very modern batik fabrics in a very old machine. So if you haven't seen the first video yet, it's about how to prepare your papers and your fabric, and you can check it out in the link below. If you have already done that, then you're all ready to go. So let's get started. Our first job is to take our bag 1 and stack our pieces. So I'll show you how that's done. So I opened up bag 1 and I had a few stacks in bag 1 of the unit M with the background and the spike pieces. And I'm going to break it down so that I have a couple of smaller stacks of 16, so that I don't have to go piecing 62 of these at a time. So when I look at my stack of 16, already the spikes are sorted in threes, groups of threes, because there's 3 spikes on each unit M piece of paper. I want to stack these, and so I'm going to take the spikes apart and I'm going to stack them one at a time in a group of 16. So I'll take one of each of all 16, and then I'll do it again 2 more times. So I've already done that. So I have my 16, and I have 16 more, and I have 16 more, so that I can stack this pile properly. So I've got my unit M's, and I look at the piece of paper and I can see that the largest number on the paper is number 7. So I'm going to start stacking with number 7 on the bottom, and I'm going to put the sew side away from me. And then number 6 goes next with the sew side away from me. There's no number 5 background piece, which means that we're going to use the spikes next. So those go in the pile next. And then we have no section 4. So the next one that gets put on is, again, another one of the spike sections. So I'm going to put that on the pile for the next one. And then we have a section 3 with the sew side away from me, and a section 2 with the sew side away from me, and the last one is a spike for the center, and that's going to go on the very top. So now they're in the order that they need to go on to the unit M piece. Now we got to prepare our unit M's. We could leave them as they are, but if you're new to paper piecing, you're going to want to trace these dotted lines, which are your seam allowance lines, on the back of your unit M piece. And we do that so that you know if you've covered the whole section with the fabric or not. Now if you don't have a light table, you could do something as simple as taking a couple spools of thread and taking your ruler and then putting your phone with the flashlight on underneath it, and you've created yourself a little mini light table. So you can do that, and you can take your ruler and you can trace your dotted lines with your ruler. There's another way to do this too. You can take a Sharpie on the front of your paper and it will go right through to the back side of the paper, enough that you can see your lines. And so I'll do one like that too for you to see. And these are just guidelines. They don't have to be absolutely perfect. But when I'm done, I have some nice lines on there that I can follow. So let me take another one and a Sharpie. And if you just make some dots on those dotted lines, they'll show right through. And you can see how those show through. You just want to make sure it's on a surface that you're not going to worry about in case it really goes through a lot. So when you're used to paper piecing, you don't really have to do that to your unit pieces anymore. You could take your flashlight as a good backlight and your first piece off your stack from your section 1, and you can sit it underneath your paper, and you can see that it covers all the way. You could also hold it up to the light above you. Any way you need to do it to see that it's going to cover the entire section. What you're trying to cover is within the dark lines of section 1. So once you've figured out where it's going to be, holding it in place, you just need a little bit of glue to keep it there. And we use a Yoo-hoo glue. Just a little bit. And that's going to hold it in place. And now you've got to trim your first line. So you have your line number 1, and you're going to put your folding template. It's just a piece of template plastic. Could be a piece of cardboard, cardstock, anything that's stiff and flat. And you put it so that line 1 is legible and facing you. And then you fold it towards yourself. And you use your add a quarter ruler to trim off that first little piece to give you a good edge that you're going to match your second piece on. Now, it's smart to do this to all of your papers in the stack. So I'm going to do it to all 16 of my pieces of paper, and then I'll show you how to sew your first line. With the piece that has the Sharpie on the back, it's really easy to see that it's covering. That it's covering what it needs to cover. And I just put a little bit of glue to hold it into place. The only thing about the Sharpie is that now when you're looking at it on the front, it can sometimes be a little confusing. So make sure you don't cover over any of the words on the front, because you need those. And as I get them prepared, I'm just going to stack them all and get them ready so they're in the same order. So I'm using batiks, and they're the same on both sides pretty much. It's hard to tell the front and the back of the fabric. If you were not using batiks, you would make sure that you are sticking the wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the paper. I don't have to worry about that, but you might, depending on the fabrics that you chose. The first piece is always stuck with the wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the paper, and after that each piece is stuck right sides together with the last piece that was put on. We do the same step to every piece that's in the pile, because then there's no confusion. You're not going back and forth and doing things over, and not rethinking every step. You're just doing the same thing over and over again. And in this case, it's 16 times. So once you get the first one right, you don't have to worry about rethinking it every time. You can sort of see when the fabric is sticking out above and below your paper. You can sort of see that way as well that the unit's going to cover those seam allowances. So if you don't want to go through the trouble of marking all your papers on the back, you can pretty much tell where it's going to land. At least on these units you can. So now we take our section 2 with the sew side away from us. I just put the unit paper underneath it so that I can remember which direction it goes in. And these are all stacked right side up. So if I pull this off my pile, I know that this unit, I stuck the wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the paper. So I know that this is the right side of the fabric. So when I'm holding my paper right off the stack with the first piece stuck to it, I can pull up my sew side, which is the top edge, and I can line it up with my raw edge on the piece that's already on the paper. And I can see this is folded, and I can see that the whole thing makes it and covers the second piece of fabric. So I know I'm going to be good. And I take that right over to my machine, and I open it up, and I stitch on the solid line 1. So at my machine, I have my stack next to me all ready to go, and I have the second piece sitting with the sew side away from me right next to the stack ready to go. And I have my first piece that I'm going to piece, and I'm going to sew right on the black solid line 1. So I want to put my needle in at the end of line 1, and I want my machine to be set on a really short stitch. On a modern machine it would be 1.5 or 1.8. On a featherweight machine it's going to be 25 or 30. On this machine there's no gauge with numbers, there's just a slide bar, and I have it on the shortest setting possible. And when I come back, I don't need a back tack or anything, I just pull it away from my machine, and then I get the next one set up to go. So I pick it up off my pile, and I place my next piece behind it, matching the raw edges. And I want to make sure that the second section, which is right here, is going to be covered by fabric, and I can see that my second section is going to be covered. So that would just determine whether I want to slide the piece one way or the other a little bit. And again, I just put my needle in, and I'm going to crank away. And I'm going to chain piece this whole stack, all 16 of these, with this first piece like this. This Frister and Rossmann machine can wind a bobbin while it's stitching, so I have a second spool of thread up here. And it's bobbin winding while I go. It's got a real smooth hand crank on it. It makes a really nice stitch. These go pretty quick once you get the groove on. I check underneath every once in a while to make sure that nothing's folded over. Just want to make sure that's going to make it under there. This one's smaller. For some reason it must have been crooked in the stack when I cut them. But I can fold it and I can make sure that it's going to hit the paper and it's going to be fine. If you watch right here, you can see the bobbin being wound while I sew. Needs to go back that way a little more. last piece. So that's the last piece. Now you cut them apart and you keep them stacked in the order that you sewed them in. So the first one you cut off goes on the bottom of the pile. So the last one you sewed goes on the bottom, and the first one you sewed ends up on the top. Now we have to open up the seam on all of them and press the seam open. So now I'm taking the one off the top, and it goes back on the bottom, because when I go to trim, they're going to go back in the reverse order again. And at the very end, I end up in the same order I started in. You can finger press. You can use a regular iron. It's good to not use steam because that might stretch out your fabric. These are really small seams, so I don't mind finger pressing them. I don't mind wood pressing them. When I have a really large seam or a curve, I might want to use a starch pen and a real iron. You can make your piles smaller. You can do groups of 8 if you want. You could do the whole quilt all at once and do all 64. It gets a little boring and you don't see a lot of progress. So some people like to make smaller stacks. So here we are, the last piece. Now we start with that one and we do our trimming. So we're going to turn it right side up so we can see the writing, and we want to be able to read line 2. And we're going to put our template on line 2. We're going to pull away the stitching here. There's a little bit of stitching that has to be loosened right there at the end. Then we put our template on line 2 and we fold the paper toward us. And we use our add a quarter ruler and we trim a seam. And it goes in the stack. And when we're all done, the stack is going to be back in the order that it needs to be in. Is to continue on with section 3. Just keep them stacked and you'll have no problem at all. We're going to be tearing all this paper off at the end, so it doesn't really matter if it tears a bit when you're ripping back that corner. It's kind of easier to do it like this first before you put your template on it. So line 2 is facing you. You pull back the paper on that little bit of extra stitching that went across the line. Just like that. And you place your template on line 2 and you fold it towards you. And then you use your add a quarter ruler and trim it. And add it to your stack. Not all of them will have a little bit to tear, but when your seam crosses the solid line, you have to tear it a little bit. And that's okay. That just secures your seam all the better when you go across that solid line. So that's the last one. They're all stacked in order. So when I take my next unit off the pile, it should be in order. And you can see the background color on this is this batik right here. And you can see that the first piece on my pile is the same batik. So I know that they're in order. So I'm just going to put them right next to my machine here with my stacked pile that I just trimmed. And I'm going to take the first one off the pile. The sew side is away from me. And again, I'm going to stack it so that the raw edges are even. And I want to make sure that this section 3 is going to be covered by the fabric that I just put here. And I can flip it and see that it is. So now to know which line we have to sew on, we look at the ones that are already sewn. And so far it's just line 1 that's sewn. So now we have to sew line 2. Sometimes it's confusing that you trim line 2 before you sew it. But if you're ever confused about which is next, just look at the ones that are already sewn and it's the next one in line. And you always stop sewing at the end of the solid line, even if it doesn't go to the edge of the paper. You could also start sewing from the middle of the paper. It doesn't matter which end of the line you start from, whichever's more convenient for you. I want to make sure that my raw edges are matched up under there. That was the last section 3. I'm just going to cut them apart and be careful stacking them. Then I will press them. And then I will fold them on the next fold line, which is line 3. And then I will trim them with my add a quarter ruler and line up section 3, which is just one of the rectangular strips. I'll line it up with the raw edge and sew on line 3. So let me keep working on this stack, and when I have it all pressed and trimmed, I'll show you how section 3 goes on. Line 3, so that I can read it. It's not upside down. And remember to keep them stacked. So they're all trimmed, and now they all have 2 sections of background on them, and it's time to add another spike. So you can see that my next spike is this peachy color, and that's just what happens to be at the top of my pile, so I know I'm in the right order. So I take my spike off and I put it right sides together with the pieces that are already pieced, and I make sure that it's going to cover. This spike has to cover all the way down to the end of the paper. So I want to make sure that my paper is going to be covered And I can do that because when I look at this fold and I look at the spike I'm putting under here, I can see that it's going to cover it when it's all opened out. So I match the raw edges, right sides together, and I piece these all 16 in a row. Okay, so they're all pieced. I've got line 1, 2, and 3 done. And when you press it open, you're going to see that you have a beginning of a second spike. You're not going to continue on this side because this one is line number 6. So you're going to go back over to the other side and do line number 4. So don't get confused, you're working back and forth on this. So we're going to do line number 4 next. And again, you're going to tear away just a little bit from the beginning of the line where it crossed over, and you're going to put your template down on the solid line 4, fold it towards yourself, and then you're going to trim off with your add a quarter ruler and stack them. Okay, they're all pieced and stacked again, and now we just trimmed, folded and trimmed line 4. So now we're going to place on line 4. I'm just going to put these next to me, and I'm going to bring my rectangles that are going to be pieced forward, and here we go. This is obviously the same color as the spikes on this unit, so I'm just going to line them up and piece. You'll notice we're working on the other side of the unit now. And the actual piece has to be able to cover the end of the unit. So I'm making sure that I bring my piece down far enough that it covers that paper. That it will cover that paper when it's opened out. That was the last one. And we cut them apart and we keep them stacked in the same order. Now this is just 16 of these. This quilt has 62 of these M units. And 62 of the bigger unit that goes around it. So there's a lot of piecing to be done here. And now we press them open and trim them, fold and trim. So don't be worried that you can see paper sticking out, because we still have 2 more pieces to put on this unit. We have these little background sections to put on. So looking at this, we just sewed on line 4, so now we're going to fold and sew on line 5 on this side. And there's a little bit to tear away on the left side of that line, and then we put the template down on the solid line 5, fold it toward us, use our add a quarter ruler to trim. And then we restack them again. So I'm just finger pressing this open. When I'm all done with this tiny little unit, I'm going to give it a good press with the iron. And I like to use the iron when I'm pressing a larger seam. These are so small, it just seems a little like overkill, so I just finger press it open. Although you do get really nice sharp seams and flat when you use a starch pen in the crease. You would use it right inside there, and then you iron over it. But I'm going to just spray starch on the entire piece and iron it all at once at the very end. Oh, I want line 5, not line 6. Got to pay attention. Once again, they're all trimmed, and now I'm going to take the next unit section off my pile, and it's section number 6. Just put that on the bottom, and I can see that I have this blue, green, and then the regular green, 2 of each, and then the dotted pink. And when I look at my pile, the background is not that way, so I must have flipped my pile. And look, lo and behold, there it is. The blue-green, the blue-green, the regular green, the regular green, the dotted pink. So I know I'm in order. I just have to start from this side of my pile instead. And the sew side on this triangle is the long side. It says sew side right on it. So I'm going to pick up my unit, and I'm going to place the sew side, right sides together, with the raw edges even. And I want to make sure that this piece gets covered. And I can tell where my fabric is behind there that it's going to get covered, so I know it's good. And I can go right ahead and sew it. I'm going to pick up my next piece off the pile and match it up and sew it. When you're matching that piece up, you always make sure you're looking at the paper side and that you're getting your raw edges even. If the piece on the bottom were much lighter in color than the pieces that I'm looking at that I exposed here, I would want to leave a little bit of it showing in the seam allowance so that I don't have any shadowing going on in the quilt, but these are all pretty much the same color. The same darkness, and so it's not going to show through. Now to fold that one, press and trim on line 6, which is on the other side, the side opposite of what we're folding. So far our unit's looking great. We're just missing one background piece on this side. We're trimming line 6. And then we're stacking. Okay, so now we're ready to piece the last piece. And I'm going to turn the pile over again because it's a little off. And here's my last piece. It's section 7. And the long edge is the sew side. So if I turn this so that I'm looking at the paper, this is already lined up so that the sew side is in the right position. And I'm going to line it up so that it's going to cover this section when you open it up after it's sewn. So if you want to check it, you can turn it over like that and look and see before you sew it. And it looks like it just has to come a little bit past the curve on the piece. And I can see that I've ripped my paper, and I just want to make sure that that stays right next to the piece it ripped from, because I don't want to change the shape of my unit. I have to trim that unit when I'm done. So I'm going to put a little piece of tape on there to make sure it doesn't stray away from the rest of the unit. Make sure I'm still lined up, and here we go. Now we've pieced all the units, and it's time to iron them nice and flat and trim them. So I'm going to take them to the reel iron, and I'm going to press them, and then I'll come back and show you how to trim them. When I trim my pieces, I like to use a smaller ruler. I have a 6 by 12 inch ruler here that I'm going to do the straight sides with, and I do the straight sides first. And all I'm basically doing is putting my ruler along the solid black line that's the outside black line and trimming off the excess. And it's really good to have a very sharp new blade when you're doing this, because you don't want to make a mess of your edges. And then, to do the curve, I turn the piece, not the blade, and I do it freehand. So I don't want to put my fingers in front of the blade, I want to put it next to the blade, and I get started on that black line, and then I can turn the piece. I kind of just lift it up, and I spin it slowly while I'm going straight with my blade. And you notice my fingers are nowhere near the blade. And there's a trimmed Unit M piece. Pretty nifty. So I'm going to continue trimming these and sewing them until I have all 62 done, and then we'll go on to the next unit.